juncture between two or more bones. Now, we have a lot of different kinds of joints, and once again we find that there's a couple of different classification schemes. There's a couple of different ways of identifying them. One way is by structure. Under this scheme we have what are called fibrous joints. Fibrous joints have no joint cavity, and the bones are connected to each other with a fibrous connective tissue. Fibrous joints. Fibrous connective tissue joins the bones together. The second type would be the cartilaginous joints. Again, the cartilaginous joints have no joint cavity. And what would you think connects the bones?
Cartilage.
Cartilage, yeah, that's a pretty easy one. So cartilage connects the bones, there's no joint cavity. And then in the third category, we have these synovial joints. Synovial joints have a structure called a joint cavity. With the synovial joints, ligaments join the bones together. And in addition, we might see cartilage and or dense fibrous connective tissue. Obviously, the synovial joints are going to be the more complicated of these three. Now, another way of looking at these is by their function. In this scheme, we have the immovable joints, the partially movable joints, and the freely movable joints. And like in the past where we've been talking about classification schemes or characterization schemes, we can put these two together. So we can have fibrous immovable joints and fibrous partially movable joints. We can have cartilaginous immovable joints, and we can have cartilaginous partially movable joints. We do get a break because all of the synovial joints are classified as freely movable, and all the freely movable joints are synovial. So they're essentially the same group. All right, so let's take a closer look at some of these categories. We'll start with the immovable fibrous joints. An immovable fibrous joint is called a suture. We know about sutures, don't we? Where do we find sutures?
Skull.
On the skull, that's right. Now, if you're using the Saladin book, this is the illustration from that book. And it's a perfectly nice picture, but I'm going to switch this over to one from a different book because it's just got a bigger close-up here. So they're looking at this suture. Anybody remember the name of this?
Squamous suture?
Squamous suture or squamosal suture. Very good. All right. Now, what we were looking at, of course, were plastic skulls. They never had any real bones in them. And even our real bone skulls are so old that anything other than the calcium deposits are long gone. There's no live tissue left. But if we had a fresh skull, all right, and we could look inside that suture, what we would see is that the bones, the parietal bone and the temporal bone, are being held together by a dense fibrous connective tissue. So between the bones, we have this connective tissue, high in fibers, very collagenous, that is holding these guys pretty firmly in place. That's a suture. Then we have the partially movable fibrous joints. There's two kinds of these. One is called a syndesmosis. A syndesmosis is a joint between side-by-side bones. All right, so again, you know, our plastic skeletons weren't going to show us any of these kinds of connections, but this is the tibia. And you know that lying right next to it in anatomical life is the fibula. And if we had a fresher specimen than those 80-year-old bones we had in the lab, what we would have seen is that there is a connecting tissue holding these two bones in place. This is a fibrous connective tissue. But these bones do have the ability to move slightly as you walk or move your leg. Where else would we find a syndesmosis?
Radius and ulna?
Radius and ulna. And that one at least I can demonstrate to you. So when you do pronation or supination, when you're kind of rolling that lower arm around on its axis, there's actually a slight crossover between the radius and the ulna. And so there is a little bit of flexibility, there is a little bit of motion between the two bones. They're not immovable against each other. They are, in fact, partially movable. Now, the second type of partially movable fibrous joint is something called a gomphosis. Oops, yeah, that's the right picture. All right. A gomphosis is the joint between a tooth and the jaw. So the socket that your tooth sits in actually has a dense fibrous connective tissue attaching the tooth to the jaw. It's a joint.
Is that why teeth sometimes fall out? Is it like loose? Let's go.
It's one of the reasons, yeah. Periodontal disease and, yeah, demineralization, bone osteoporosis, vitamin C, scurvy. Yeah. Yeah, things can happen. All right. Now, actually, this is kind of the story. Actually, it's some of the books that I've looked at say that gomphosis is a partially movable fibrous joint, and other books say it's an immovable fibrous joint, because we really don't think of our teeth as being wiggly. All right? So last time I was at the dentist, knowing I was going to have to give you guys this lecture, I asked my dentist, I said, gomphosis, partially movable or immovable? And without having to think about it, just that fast he came back, he said, partially movable. I said, really? You didn't have to think about it? You didn't have to go look it up? He goes, no, partially movable. He says, let me tell you why. He said, real teeth in their natural socket will flex slightly when you bite and chew. So when you bite down on something, that tooth is going to kind of move slightly in that socket on the connective tissues. He says, when we put in an implant, an artificial tooth, or when people have dentures or bridges or partials or something like that, he says they will bite down just as hard as they normally would, but those don't flex, and they break under the pressure of someone just biting down on something a little bit too hard. So he says teeth won't break, not because they're harder, but because they will move slightly in that socket, whereas your implant is cemented into the bone directly and it can't flex, it can't move. He also pointed out that if you get something stuck between your teeth, like little seeds or something stuck between your teeth, or little pieces of food, you feel that because the food is pushing the teeth to the side, flexing it just a little bit in that socket. And of course, then there's orthodontia. If you've ever had braces, you know teeth move slowly and under protest, but they will move. So yes, he was absolutely convinced that gomphosis is a partially movable fibrous joint, and I'm passing that on to you. We have expert opinion on the matter. All right. See, I do my research. All right. Then we have the immovable cartilaginous joints. This is something called a synchondrosis. I need my next set of pictures, so hang on here. These have got to be the world's most boring videos. I'm sure your friends are like, oh my God.
Our friends don't look at them. It's just, our class. And it helps. It helped a lot with the last test.
What happened to the other picture? That was... All right. I can't find the big picture, but I've got another picture. All right. Okay. So what we're looking at here is pretty much the rib cage and the sternum. And for most of these ribs, their attachment to the sternum through the cartilage is flexible. When you breathe in and out, when you rotate your torso, you know which muscles do that? Compress your abdomen, rotate your torso. No, you're gonna have to know that by next week. There you go. All right, so when you're breathing in and out, those ribs do move slightly. The cartilage is sort of flexible, but the first rib, that little bitty flat guy right up here by the clavicles, that first rib does not move. It is an immovable joint that is attached to the sternum with cartilage. So it is an immovable cartilaginous joint. It is a synchondrosis. Another example would be the epiphyseal plates. Obviously, adults don't have these anymore. Their cartilage has been converted into bone, so they have epiphyseal lines. But in children and teenagers, the connection between the primary center of ossification and the secondary center of ossification is still cartilage, and those aren't supposed to move, right? Those are supposed to stay stuck. So those are also examples of immovable cartilaginous joints or synchondroses. Then we have the partially movable cartilaginous joints. These are called a symphysis. And we've also encountered one of these already. Where did we find a symphysis? Which part of the pelvis? The pubic symphysis, right. So at the front of the pelvis, the two pubic bones in life, not on our plastic skeletons, but in life would be joined together with a fairly nice thick pad of fibrocartilage. And that forms the structure called the pubic symphysis. Now, we're probably not feeling this, we're probably not aware of this, but when we walk, when we run, when we dance, these bones do actually move slightly against each other. There is a bit of flexibility there as you are shifting your weight, putting more pressure on one side than the other. There is a little bit of flexibility in the pubic bones at that symphysis. The most extreme example of movement in these bones occurs during childbirth. During labor and delivery, hormones are released that will soften the cartilage and allow it to stretch, because the baby's head's got to get through there somehow, all right? So those two pubic bones are going to get pushed apart by the process of the baby's head coming through the birth canal, and typically it doesn't go all the way back to the original position. That cartilage is kind of permanently stretched out. And so women who've had babies walk a little differently than women who have not. Their pelvis is a little broader, and they have a slightly different stance and a slightly different gait. You know what to look for, and I don't, so don't worry about it. But yeah, the people who say that they know the difference, they probably do. There is a slight difference in the way mothers walk. Okay, pubic symphysis. Now, the only freely movable joints are the synovial joints. This is the illustration from the Saladin book. I'm not a big fan of starting with this one. I don't want to just jump off into this, because this is a picture of an actual joint. This is a real joint. It is the joint between the proximal and medial phalanges. Proximal medial phalanges. And it's even for a fairly simple synovial joint, it's got a lot going on here. So I'm going to switch over to a picture which is not only bigger, but actually this is no real joint in the human body. This is kind of an idealized, generalized, generic synovial joint that'll show you guys the basic structure here. All right? Bless you. You look unhappy because your nose is running. Do you want a paper towel? Okay. All right. All right. So this is no real joint, but here we would have one of the bones in the joint, and here's another bone in the joint. And in a synovial joint, what we should find at the ends of the bones are these nice thick caps of hyaline cartilage. These are what are called the articular cartilages. So each bone in the joint should have a nice, smooth, frictionless, non-stick surface of hyaline cartilage. Now, in the picture, they've kind of exaggerated the size of the space, but there is a small space between the two bones. This space between the bones is called the joint cavity. Now, this cavity is not empty. This is not a vacuum, nor is it filled with air. There is a fluid in here, and this fluid is called the synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is normally clear. It doesn't usually have any color. And it's usually pretty thick or viscous. It's not watery, it's dense, it's heavy, it's thick, it's viscous. It's also kind of slippery. This stuff's just a little bit slimy. That's because the function of synovial fluid is to act as a lubricant. When these bones in this joint move, that synovial fluid is going to make that movement smooth and easy and without any sort of bumps or abrasions or difficulties. Between the articular cartilage, which is giving the ends of the bones a nice smooth surface, and the synovial fluid, which is lubricating the motion, joints should move easily and without interference. Now, in addition, synovial fluid is going to act as a shock absorber. So if the joint experiences an unexpected impact or trauma, the synovial fluid is going to act kind of like a bumper, kind of like bubble wrap. It'll absorb some of that shock, some of that trauma. Now, I'd hate to say less important function, but a less well-known function, probably a secondary function of the synovial fluid, is it does help distribute nutrients to the cartilage. Cartilage doesn't have any blood vessels of its own. Cartilage is not vascularized. And so it depends entirely on the tissues around it for oxygen and nutrients. These articular cartilages will get some of that from the bone, but they'll also get some of that from nutrients and gases that are being distributed by the movement of the synovial fluid. Okay. Now, the synovial fluid is being made by the structure that's shown here is this kind of dark blue line. This is the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane encloses the joint cavity. It's the boundary of the joint cavity. You can see it kind of runs from one bone to the next. So it is making the synovial fluid and creating the joint cavity, making the space. But the synovial membrane is really thin. It's pretty fragile. It's not very strong. By itself, it would never be able to hold these bones together while the joint's in motion. Cover your mouth when you yawn, please. All right? So it needs reinforcement. Just outside the synovial membrane, you see this thicker structure. This is a fibrous connective tissue called the joint capsule. So right outside the synovial membrane, we get this reinforcing fibrous connective tissue that forms the joint capsule. Now I'm going to go back to this one. All right. In many of our joints, the joint capsule is then itself strengthened and reinforced by ligaments. Dense, regular, proper connective tissue that runs from one bone to the next across the outer surface of the joint capsule, which of course is on the outside of the synovial membrane, which is outside the joint cavity. Layers. I think it's time to take a break.